was offended. That's against the law.
Someone was offended. That's against the law.
That's against. There is actually a bill in the legislature that you need to know about. It's HJR8, and this bill would literally legitimize corruption of the federal government.
It's a Thought Police free zone. The Liberty Lineup radio show, where independent thought just can't be bought.
I'm an American. Red, white, and blue. And I'm a citizen of this world and of heaven. Some things were meant to be together. I believe in faith and freedom. Got a country too. I believe with faith and freedom, we're gonna make it through.
Welcome to the Thursday segment of the Liberty Lineup, a radio show. This is the Naked Truth segment with Ben McClintock and Enoch Moore of DefendingUtah.org. Today we will be talking with constitutional scholar and expert Scott Bradley. There's a bill in the legislature that's coming up for a vote in committee tomorrow that will literally legitimize the corruption of the federal government. Stay tuned.
'Cause everything's on the line. We gotta rise up. We gotta stay strong. To save our way of life. I believe in faith and freedom. Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. This is Ben McClintock, your host. I am from DefendingUtah.org. And as I mentioned earlier, there is actually a bill in the legislature that is about to be voted on in committee tomorrow that you need to know about. It's HJR8. The author of the bill is Representative Ken Ivory from West Jordan. And this bill would literally legitimize the corruption of the federal government, saying that they're not violating the Constitution now, that we need an amendment, we needed a constitutional convention to rein them in. And so we've got Scott Bradley on the line. Let me see if I can make sure and get this going for you. Scott, are you there? I cannot hear Scott. I hope. Oh, let's see here. Oh, telephone. Sorry, wrong one. Scott, you there now?
I am.
Oh, right. Thank you. So we've got HJR8 by Ken Ivory. You've had a lot of good things to say about Ken Ivory in the past. What do you think about this one?
Your tongue-in-cheek is rather prominent at this point. I believe that this bill, now there are several, there's quite a number of these that are being replicated around the country. But if you take this bill, its format, its wording, and whether it's in this state or some other state that is being fostered in, I believe that, and my assessment is that it is the most dangerous bill of its type that's ever been brought forth. In the past, there's been basically this facade that those that are asking for a con have kind of taken. They said basically, we want to fix the balanced budget or some such thing. Now, by the way, it depends on the audience they're presenting it to. In Hawaii, they present these resolutions to get rid of the Second Amendment. But here in Utah, because of the quote-unquote conservative mentality of much of the electorate, they co-opt it into an area that they think will sell with those people. So they sing to the choir the song that they want to hear. Mm-hmm. But all across the nation, there's this effort to call it con. And last year, Utah foolishly passed a resolution that would call for a convention to look at a balanced budget amendment. Now, I've spent years looking at balanced budget amendments. Every one that I've been able to find, and maybe I've missed one or two, but I've got a stack of them that I've looked at, and every single one of them is fatally flawed. They will not balance the budget. Every single one of them has weasel words in it, wiggle room, in every way, shape, and form. And on top of that, they have other problems in that they will basically constitutionalize unconstitutional spending, because if you have money, you can spend it under these amendments. But under our current Constitution, you can only spend money for those things which are constitutionally authorized. So anyway, last year, Utah foolishly passed that. They had another foolish kind of clause in it that said they were going to call the Utah delegation home if it didn't go just like they wanted. So they would have got the Constitution Convention rolling, and then they were going to call Utah home, and we wouldn't have a voice in it. So it was sick and wrong at every level. But they've had this pretext, this pretense, this phony baloney that says we're only going to attack one thing at a time, and so it's not dangerous. It is okay. Mm-hmm. This resolution, if read carefully, literally opens the entire United States Constitution for revision or replacement.
It doesn't even pretend to make it about one subject. It opens it up to several, and they're so vague it could be about anything, right?
Absolutely, unequivocally, and certainly your listeners need to go to the Utah legislature, to click on bills. When you get in there, you need to look at the 2006 general session, and then you need to go to the joint resolutions, HJR, and there's 1 through 49. You click on that, and you come down to this one, which is 808. Okay. If you look at lines 33 through 38, that is the guts, if you will, of this thing that absolutely would eviscerate or potentially could eviscerate. I'm not willing to take that risk with my grandchildren's Constitution. But basically, they're looking for a convention of states, they call it, and it's just a euphemism for a convention that will change the Constitution, because that is the intent. And they say to propose amendments to the Constitution to impose fiscal restraint. We have to assume that's probably a balanced budget amendment of some type, and I've already said that I've never found one that would balance the budget, and in many instances, they literally open the door for spending on any subject or process or for any purpose that they chose to, because it basically says you can spend money if you got it.
Right.
Right now, the Constitution limits the power of the national government to spend money for those powers, for those purposes that were delegated to the United States government. And of course, they've been ignoring that, and that's the whole problem with the out-of-control budget. Anyway, so the first thing they would do is fiscal restraints on the federal government. Second issue would be limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. This is right out of the resolution. Now, by definition, a Constitution defines the power and jurisdiction of the government. And if you're saying you're going to open that up to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, by the way, there's a number of things we could talk about. I know we don't have a ton of time, but
that sounds a bit redundant.
Yeah, it's like we really mean it this time. No, the fact is it's being violated, but the ones that are purporting these amendments such as this that are out there that are purporting to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government actually completely destroy the separation of powers. It completely destroys the federal system, the jurisdictions between states and national governments, and literally it would allow the changing, and we could in detail explain to you why this is it if we had time, and I'd be pleased to do that. But literally it allows the legislature, the House and the Senate, or the states to amend the United States Constitution with supermajority in the House and Senate, 261 in the House and 60 in the Senate, and 30 states, or that's an or, that does both have to be. But it literally would allow them to change the Constitution by basically them saying, we think this is how it ought to be. It would open up such a bucket of worms. The idea of term limits on the Supreme Court, and we look at what's going on right now. It's current events. We have a Supreme Court justice that's passed away within the last few months of a president that's a usurper in every case. But there's this battle going on. What has happened in the Supreme Court over the last several generations, literally, has been that the Supreme Court nominees are vetted based upon agenda. And the problem is this has become a political plum. And people think that they can basically change the Constitution because people falsely believe that the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says. People believe that if their person can get in there, male or female now, we can get our agenda to do whatever we want, and And this idea of the limits and bounds of constitutional government and all this kind of is just gone to the wind. If we every 4 years had to replace a certain number of our Supreme Court justices, that would become the political plum. It would be what's going on right now on steroids. And the idea that the Supreme Court is there to make certain that the plain English words of the Constitution are followed, it's out the window. It's out the door. I mean, you got Judge Roberts on Obamacare saying that, well, because the national government has the power to tax, we can do a tax on anything we want. So that means they could tax you for anything, not just health care. It's a complete perversion. So anyway, we could go in detail if you wanted, looking at each one of the amendments that I've been able to find that would, in their stated purpose, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Virtually all of them make constitutional what is currently unconstitutional. Like, for example, one that Mark Levin puts out there it would be an amendment, it would be part of the Constitution if it were passed, that if the executive, the president, were to impose regulations, let's say it's an EPA regulation, a coal tax thing, maybe it's a carbon tax, maybe it's a healthcare thing, whatever, that was going to cost the nation more than $100 million, then a joint body would have to review that and decide whether it was okay or not. Huh?
It's already illegal.
It's already illegal. But the amendment that Levin has proposed said that if it hits the threshold of $100 million, it gets to be reviewed by the House and the Senate.
And that's what I meant when we first opened the show today, is that these amendments would actually expand the federal government. It would give the government more power. It would make their crimes that they're involved in now, their lawlessness now, it would make it legal. It would legitimize those things.
It literally would. So think about this, folks. If something was a $90 million imposition upon some regulation that the president came up with, was a $90 million deal, nobody gets to look at it. It just goes through. I mean, these things are absolutely absurd. The Constitution currently says all legislative power is held by the House and the Senate. That's it. No further discussion. The president has no legislative power except for approving or disapproving and then having it overridden or not. But so this idea of the limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, every single resolution I have found that they're coming up with now would actually make constitutional that which is currently unconstitutional, would expand the federal government. And then, of course, the third thing that's in this on line 37 of the resolution is limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. Well, we've talked about a little bit about the Supreme Court and limiting the terms, but what we sweat bullets now between November and January when we get done with an election because we got a lame duck Congress, and what are those turkeys? Well, I guess they're not turkeys; they're not ducks. But anyway, what are those turkeys going to do to us during that 2-month period where those have been ousted? And the fact of the matter is, if you had term limits, and let's say you said senators can only serve 2 terms. Okay, first 6-year term, they're out there wringing their hands and looking over their shoulder and saying to their constituents, how am I doing, guys? We're going to be able to get elected again? Huh? And then after they're elected the second time, we got 6 years.
We're heading off to a break. That's the thing. That's something I want to hold off on. And so as we're going into that, Enoch, they've got the HJR8, this CON bill, coming up in committee tomorrow. You want to give us the information on that so people that want to stand up for the Constitution and oppose this can go?
Sure, that's 2 o'clock, Friday, February 19th, tomorrow, as you said, at the Revenue and Taxation Committee hearing room at the state capitol.
And that's room 445, I think. And in addition to that, don't get there at 2 and expect a seat. I think the bad guys are going to stack the
You got to cover that up. So this is Ben McClintock and Enoch Moore with The Naked Truth on K-Talk, where we think right and wrong, not right and left. We are talking with constitutional expert Scott Bradley on the dangers of a convention and why it's not the proper solution to our problems. We'll be right back after the break. You are back with Ben McClintock and Enoch Moore of DefendingUtah.org. This is The Naked Truth, where we think right and wrong, not right and left, on the Liberty Lineup radio show on K-Talk. Sponsored by, this is Patriot Mobile. They've just changed their name from EOS to Patriot. People are asking us how they can join our grassroots network to get our updates and alerts. Just go to LibertyLineup.com. That's LibertyLineup.com and sign up. And if you like what you're hearing, you can support the cause of liberty with a donation of any amount. That's LibertyLineup.com. You can also like and share our Facebook page, The Liberty Lineup Radio Show. And this is Ben McClintock with Enoch Moore. And we've been speaking with constitutional scholar and expert Scott Bradley. If you want more information about Scott Bradley, he's got a great website and a great book. The website is freedomsrisingsun.com, and the book is To Preserve the Nation. You should pick up your copy. It's just one of those great books to help you understand the Constitution and be able to be better at defending it. And you can go to the website, freedomsrisingsun.com. Scott, thanks for joining us to talk about the Convention of States bill coming up tomorrow in the committee.
Well, it's always good to visit with you, but I got to say that this is a tragic time. And the subject we're talking about is truly sad. I mean, the founding fathers of this nation, noble, great men that paid such a price to get this nation on its feet and have it grow legs and start, walking. And in the 45-plus years that I've been immersed in their words and works, I am absolutely amazed at how often they spoke about their posterity. A lot of these men knew that they would never live to see the fruition of everything they were working for, and yet and still they were working for it because they loved their posterity. You say love flows downhill. It really does. These men thought much about what they hoped for their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, their whole posterity. And in fact, they embodied that into the preamble of the United States Constitution. They did what they did, not only for themselves, but for their posterity. And what is happening right now, it's the most highly organized, cleverly disguised, powerfully promoted effort that has ever been in this nation to undermine, to cut the legs out from whatever you want to call it, the United States Constitution. And if I could just say one thing that might get the attention of your listeners and kind of light their fuse, if you think about who's going to be at this next convention, if they pull this off, there is not going to be a single one of the original American founders there.
No.
The people that will be there are the ones that got us in the mess we're in right now.
Exactly.
It's absolutely unequivocal. The people that will be selected to go to this are going to be state representatives, they're going to be national representatives, they're going to be retired judges, they're going to be former presidents, they'll be former governors. You pick whatever poison you want. And if you think about opening this up, think how the last time we had a national election, and the time before that.
Right.
How did the majority of the people vote? The majority of the people voted for Mr. Obama. And the Electoral College came out in his favor.
Even in our own so-called conservative state, you've got the majority of the legislature voting for tax increases, voting to put tax increases on the ballot, voting for increased gas taxes, voting for increased property taxes. And just yesterday, they've they all wring their hands about how bad count my vote is, but they all yesterday voted to keep it in. So they're lying to us when they pretend to be conservative, and they're promoting the establishment agenda. And
I don't know exactly what the spread will be this year because it varies anywhere almost from 25% to 50%.
Right.
How the year goes. But let's just say it's the low end. Utah gets 25% of its annual budget from the feds, unconstitutionally, I might add, because there's no authority for the federal government to take money in and then redistribute it to the states. And we're known as the best managed state in the nation. And we are behind the eight ball in the curve by at least 25 to 30% anyway, let's say, in terms of how we pay our own bills. And we balance our budget, but we do it on the backs of people from New York and Chicago and Illinois, different places.
Balancing the budget's one thing, but we're still in debt. We balanced our budget, but that doesn't. People kind of confuse balanced budget with being debt-free. Our state, we spend more than we come in every year.
Yeah, we have to, and they say, well, bonding isn't indebtedness because we're committing future revenue streams to this. Well, it's like, okay, well, I am too. Every time I use my Visa card, I'm
committing future revenue.
But it's a debt, people. I mean, it is a debt, and in spite of the fact they refuse to call it that, that's what we are. And it is a facade. But these people are going to, not just Utah people, we're going to have California people and Illinois people and New York people and Florida people. And, I mean, we're going to have people from all over the country at this convention.
Hawaii, which is the one that two of the amendments they've proposed are one to repeal the Second Amendment and the other one to make Obamacare a part of the Constitution.
Yeah, they're afraid it might get unseated again with something that happens in the Supreme Court. Well, they really literally want to incorporate Obamacare into the Constitution. People, this is absurd.
George Soros, people don't realize, is one of the biggest financial backers of the convention.
Well, that doesn't surprise me. And honestly, whomever is pressing it, in whatever state they're in, they are singing the tune that they think their constituency wants to hear. And Utah wrings their hands about this debt thing. And debt is a problem. The reason it's a problem is because we stopped applying the Constitution.
Right.
The Constitution is no longer abided by. Probably, easily, arguably, 80% of all expenditures that come out of the nation right now, and basically our indebtedness, is unconstitutional.
Is the constituency really more on the side of the con? I mean, so take Count My Vote, for example. The constituency is clearly not on the side of Count My Vote, but yet they all just voted for it. So is it different with the con?
The establishment basically winked and nodded at this thing and said, yeah, that's the way we're going, guys. Yeah, we're going to go more towards democracy rather than republic.
Yeah.
You see, the fourth section of the fourth article of the Constitution requires that we have a Republican form of government, and that means representative government. And the Count My Vote moves us closer to democracy, just like the 17th Amendment did with the selection of our senators. And that's turned out to be a happily ever after story, hasn't it? I mean, our nation has started to unravel in 1913 when we did that. And now we have these huge debts, and we can fiscally prove that when we track the debt level from 1913 until now. That's where the debt came on, because the senators are now being directly elected by the people, and the people want to eat at the trough, and so they sell their vote to those that will give them the greatest return, perceived greatest return. And what's happened is we've destroyed the great foundation the founders gave us. We don't need to correct the Constitution. We just need to abide by it. And
well, that's one thing I want to bring up is that people will say, well, how come you claim to like the Constitution so much, but you just hate Article 5? Accusing us of being, what's the word I'm thinking of hypocrisy.
Yeah, it's a hypocrite, or you're saying, oh, well, what you're doing is picking and choosing.
Right.
It's interesting. Article 5 is in there, and there's no question about that. But in the summer of 1788, the United States Constitution was ratified. It became effective when the sufficient number of states had ratified. And by the way, they changed the Constitution completely when they were just supposed to amend the previous one, but that's another story. But it got ratified in the summer of 1788. In November of 1788, so several months later, New York, some representatives from New York were still pressing for the idea that we might want to have another convention. James Madison wrote a magnificent letter that basically pled with the people. He said, in the current political environment, this is going to be a disaster. I'm not going to read through the whole thing because we don't have time. But the fact of the matter is, think in 1788, who was still living? All the guys that were at the original convention. I mean, these great noble statesmen. Who of those are still living? None of them. Who have we got? We got the people that are in our legislature, in our governor's jobs, in our United States Congress. We've got former presidents. We've got, you name them. By the way, last year,
the ones promoting it, the major sponsors in both the House and the Senate, Wayne Niederhauser and Ken Ivory, have the worst voting records. They promote bigger government and higher taxes all the time.
Well, and we go, huh? We say, maybe they're going to be the ones we trust. Are you kidding? By the way, last year, a bill was put forth by Ken Ivory that had the same intent. It was HJR8.
Right.
Okay? And HJR8 basically had the same tripping points, if you will, about balanced budget and stopping the United States, realigning the jurisdiction and the power of the government and being able to limit terms. And it was favorably passed out of the committee that they handpicked to put it in. And then it was defeated on the floor, very wisely, because those on the floor are going, huh? What are we doing? We're opening up the whole Constitution with this thing. So they defeated it last year, and it's back again.
It's the same bill, and I want to focus on the three. It has three major points in this call, and so it doesn't even pretend to do what they usually they'll say, oh, we limit it to one subject, and there's no way it can get out of control. Well, this one doesn't even pretend to go there. And the three subjects in this HJR8 is the first one is fiscal restraints, i.e., they intend to have a balanced budget amendment, which, first of all, last year they already called for a BBA, so this is redundant. And what's interesting is I want to get your thoughts on this specifically, is that, first of all, if they stuck to the Constitution, the budget would already be balanced, A, and then B, that 49 of the 50 states already have a requirement for a balanced budget, and the only state with a balanced budget is the one without a BBA in their state constitution.
Isn't that astounding? I mean, it's based upon the character of those that are in the offices.
Right.
Our trusted representatives. You know, criminals look for opportunities to skirt the law in any way, shape, and form. Lawyers do that. If you have a contract and you have an opposing lawyer that's trying to figure out a way to wheedle his client's way out of it, they don't look at contracts as anything binding.
Right.
They look at ways to get around them, and that's what the United States Constitution is. It is in fact, St. George Tucker called it a legally binding contract.
And all those lawyers that we have in the Congress and the legislature are just trying to find ways to get around it.
Absolutely. And so we have lawyers like Roberts in the Supreme Court that says, well, because we got the power to tax, we can tax anything we darn well please, and therefore Obamacare is legal. Not the case.
We can even tax you for things you haven't bought. So
you could tax how many kids you have if you want. You could tax what color shoelaces you wear.
Right.
I mean, if you use Roberts' logic, it's a universal carte blanche. You can do whatever you want. And actually, the powers are granted and limited, and they have only the jurisdiction given. But the people have failed to continue to hold their feet in the fire because, like I say, well, I ran for the Senate, U.S. Senate twice. And so I'm a two-time loser, I guess people could say. But fact of the matter is, I literally had people contacting me and say, if I vote for you, what will you give me? And it's like, really?
That's crazy.
They're selling their votes. And the senators and congressmen sell their votes, too.
They do.
You know, when
we've just got a couple of minutes. I want to go through. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I wanted to go through the other parts of the proposed Constitutional Convention, the Amendments Convention. The second part of it was to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. That's what they want to do. What's wrong with that?
Well, it's already limited to the nth degree.
Article 1, Section 8.
And the Congress has only the powers granted.
Right.
And the 10th Amendment absolutely drives the nail into that coffin, or whatever you want to call it. It says if we didn't give you the power, you do not have it.
And the language here is so vague that they could write anything into it that they wanted to.
Well, like I say, I've got here in front of me the Mark Levin's Liberty Amendments, and that's a wonderful study. Not that I support any of it. Well, okay, he does say let's get rid of the 17th Amendment. We could do that just the way we got rid of the 18th Amendment with the 21st Amendment by using two-thirds of both houses and then ratifying with three-quarters of the states. We don't have to call a convention. So there are a couple of things, and they say, okay, I'll give them that if they'll go on to without using the convention.
Right.
But the Levin amendments, by and large, are a wonderful study in how perverted it would become. Now, he's an attorney. He has the aura of being associated with Ronald Reagan, and he has this talk radio program and all this kind of stuff and all these people, and he's called the Great One or whatever. Anyway.
Right.
the problem is that he's written this in such a manner that it absolutely destroys the separation of powers, checks and balances, and honestly,
so you've got people like Mark Levin then, and others like Glenn Beck and Sean Hannity, and all in bed with George Soros. Basically, is what we're looking at, because George Soros is the major backer of this whole process, along with the liberal wolf pack, and so these guys are going along with them to give the government more power.
Well, and that's true. And what's really fascinating is that Mike Lee supports a convention.
Right.
Rubio has come out in support of a convention. Cruz has come out in support of a convention. I mean, folks, this is highly organized, cleverly disguised, powerfully promoted, and it is an effort to eviscerate
For sure.
that magnificent sacred document that we've got right now.
So we are heading off to a break. We're going to have to let you go. We've got some other things we've got to get into, but I appreciate you coming on, Scott. To learn more about Scott Bradley, go to freedomsrisingsun.com. Get his book, To Preserve a Nation, freedomsrisingsun.com. And this is Ben McClintock with Enoch Moore. You can go to tomorrow, at 2 o'clock, in the Taxation Committee hearing room at the State Capitol to testify against HJR8. And so this has been McClintock and Enoch Moore with the Liberty Lineup. This is The Naked Truth, where we think right and wrong, not right and left, on Thursday. For more information, go to k-talk.com. Welcome back. This is Ben McClintock and
Enoch Moore
from defendingutah.org. You're listening to Liberty Lineup, the Naked Truth segment, where we think right and wrong, not right and left. And, of course, we are sponsored by Patriot Mobile. Join our grassroots network to get our updates and alerts. Just go to libertylineup.com. That's libertylineup.com and sign up. And if you like what you're hearing, support Liberty with a donation of any amount. That's libertylineup.com. You can also like and share our Facebook page, the Liberty Lineup Radio Show. Just before we went to the break, we were speaking with constitutional scholar Scott Bradley about the dangers of a bill coming up to a hearing tomorrow, HJR8, which would call for a convention of states giving the government even more power than they already have now. So make sure and write and call and email and text your state reps and those on that committee and tell them to oppose HJR8, that the government doesn't need any more power.
And if you want to do something to defend the Constitution, some actual action you can take, the committee hearing tomorrow, 2 o'clock, on HJR8 in the Revenue and Taxation Committee's hearing room at the Utah State Capitol.
Great. So now on the line, we have one of our Liberty Lineup hosts, Garrett Smith. Garrett, you're on. Are you?
Thanks for having me on.
Hey, Garrett. Thanks for joining us. Tell us about your show.
Great. So we are the Monday show. It's called Faith in the Fire, and we focus on religious liberty. But, I tuned in for a few minutes before I called and listened to Scott Bradley and some of the discussion you had. And it made me just kind of thinking, well, how could I summarize our show? Well, the theme, I think, of what's going on across the country is that the federal and state governments are just out of control. They're too big. We're in huge debt. And, that affects religious liberty. There's, these two problems. We have more regulation, even if it's gun control or, if it's this convention of states, whatever it is, that will impact religious liberty as well. And, in the second way that we're seeing it, religious liberty really taking a hit is in the court system. So those are, some of the issues that we're facing right now.
For sure.
And one thing that we had mentioned on the Monday show that I thought might be good to bring up here is our listeners need to just understand and be aware of how the court system is working and what the Supreme Court has been doing over the last few years with respect to religious liberty. And, Justice Scalia's death is, that's really sad, and it will impact religious liberty, because he has been, he's not always right on point, but he has been on the side of protecting religious liberty. And I wanted to just give, if it's all right, a couple examples of,
yes, please,
how the court has worked around and continued to degrade liberty. So they developed what's called the Lemon test, and it was a 3-pronged test that became the standing test to determine if a law or someone's religious behavior was going against the law or against the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And as time went on, in 1992, they had the case of Lee versus Wiseman, and they, someone sued trying to stop, a neutral, non-denominational prayer from being said at a graduation. So they're like, well, prayers have always been said at graduations, but we don't want that anymore because, that's the government establishing religion.
Right.
And so the Supreme Court's looking at the case, and they say, well, under the Lemon test, it doesn't really fit, and they'll be able to say this prayer. So let's come up with a new test. Let's have a coercion test. And basically, even though the students who don't want to hear a prayer can choose not to attend the graduation, really everyone needs to attend their graduation. That's something that's so important in their lives, and so they're being coerced to hear this prayer. And then they struck it down and said, yeah, that you can't do that. So they didn't follow their own tests, and then just a few years later they came up with this endorsement test, because there were student-led prayers at extracurricular activities. So after school was even out, but it was still on school property, and it didn't fit in the coercion test because, no student is forced to attend a football game. It didn't fit the Lemon test, so they said, well, this is an endorsement of religion by the school. So they kept on basically finding whatever test they could do to limit religious liberty. And
just making up whatever they want to get what they want done.
Exactly. They make a decision, and then they use whatever argument they can do to support that decision. And, Justice Scalia was really one of the only justices who would call out the Supreme Court and call out their hypocrisy. So he said that the Lemon test is, a ghoul in a late-night horror movie that repeatedly sits up in a grave, after being killed and buried, because the Supreme Court, they use it when it's, when it's in their favor, and they're
right.
like, oh yeah, well, we'll resurrect the Lemon test in this case, but if it doesn't fit our purposes, we'll just kill it and, bury it again. So that's the danger, and that's what's going on in our court system, and it's important for our listeners to understand that, because at this point, the courts are not being accountable to the people. This last decision, the gay marriage decision last year, it went against, the majority of states who wanted marriage between a man and a woman, yet,
and the Constitution itself doesn't even mention the word marriage, and so they've got really no authority to even talk about marriage. Plus, in the marriage has always been a religious institution, and so it would really be like the Supreme Court ruling on baptism or any other religious ordinance.
Right. Exactly. It's marriage, baptism, these religious ordinances are pre-societal.
Right.
It's not given by government.
Right.
Yeah.
And so in our show we've talked a lot about nullification, and which is really what it is. It's the application of the 10th Amendment, having the states enforce their part of the contract on the federal government. And so when the Supreme Court does this, so many people seem to capitulate and say, oh, well, the Supreme Court ruled. It's just, God spoke down from Mount Sinai and told us what to do.
Right.
What's the legal precedence for actually, Thomas Jefferson talked about, telling the courts to enforce it, meaning they can't, so just go stick it. You know, what's the solution do you see to courts that are out of control in these ways?
Well, the solution that's not being put into place is the separation of powers in the federal government, because, exactly like Thomas Jefferson, well, you enforce it then. If the Supreme Court makes a decision, back when they were trying to force integration, Eisenhower at the beginning said, I'm not going to do that. And so the decision was made, and it sat for a year or two before, the Supreme Court's like, well, you're destroying our credibility. And so Eisenhower caved in, and,
Actually, they destroyed their own credibility by ruling that way.
Yeah, exactly.
That's kind of like when they, in the Dred Scott case, where they institutionalized slavery. And what people don't know, it's kind of interesting. We're just actually talking about this in our school, about how it was actually it was a slave state that freed Dred Scott, and it was the Supreme Court that put him back into slavery.
Slavery, yeah.
And so just because the Supreme Court ruled something doesn't mean A, it's right, and B, doesn't mean it's enforceable, right? Wouldn't you say?
Exactly, unless, the separation of powers and the executive branch starts to enforce it, which we saw even with Kim Davis. She's like, well,
right.
I don't agree with the Supreme Court, and yet the executive gets involved, and she gets thrown in jail, and that's just how it goes. So we're not seeing any change in the federal government,
right.
But where we have seen a win, and where our listeners and the people of Utah and the people of the United States can stand up and make a difference, is by following the example of what happened in Houston. They had an anti-discrimination bill that was being enforced. They had a lesbian mayor who was promoting it, and it got passed. And because of that bill, they started trying to subpoena church sermons from pastors who were teaching that, homosexuality is wrong. And by the way, they were teaching it from the Bible, so it wasn't even quoting scriptures. And they started trying to go after them. Well, these people, they fought it. They got it on the ballot, and the people of Houston, it wasn't even close. It was almost 2/3 to a third. 62% voted against anti-discrimination. And so Houston has more religious liberty right now than Utah, because we have a Senate Bill 296 that was implemented last year, and we're seeing, the effects of that right now, is even though the plain language of the statute only applies to housing and employment, we see that they're applying it across the board.
Speaking of free speech, I wanted to play this clip I just came across last night of a police officer ticketing somebody because they were offending someone. So just play that real quick, Enoch.
Okay.
I don't know if you've seen this yet, Garrett.
Oh, so what's your name and your badge number?
My name is Officer Wormsley.
Wormsley? Okay.
1948.
Okay.
So will you allow me to speak now?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so basically what I was saying earlier, we had somebody that was offended by the gestures you were making, and that's our job, is to make sure that doesn't happen, because these are students that's walking in this mall, like right here. I know you're not on campus, but you're right on campus offending students on the campus. So the job here is to write you up as a citation, disorderly conduct, for offending someone.
Does freedom of speech protect offensive speech?
Does freedom of speech do what?
Protect offensive speech?
It doesn't matter if freedom of speech. Someone was offended. That's against the law. I don't want to argue.
Right,
Someone was offended. That's against the law.
That's against. So what do you think about that kind of stuff? I mean, is that something we see in the courts as well? This is an officer giving somebody a citation for offending somebody, and it didn't matter about freedom of speech. That's irrelevant when you're offending somebody, right?
Absolutely. I can't remember which founder said it, but free speech means protecting speech that we disagree with as well. So, just because we don't agree doesn't mean we enforce it or keep people from doing it. And really, it goes back to the proper role of government. should the
Right.
government control our lives?
Well, can you imagine if that was the litmus test for freedom of
Don't be
speech?
offensive.
If that was the litmus test, if it offends somebody, you no longer have the right to say it. I mean, that would be. It'd be. I mean, there'd be literally no limit to it. We wouldn't be allowed to talk because the way you said something offended me, and so I'm going to write you a citation.
Right, but it would also be discriminatory because if you quoted a scripture from the Bible that was offensive, you'd be under prosecution. But if you talked about how you have a right to a gay marriage and that's offensive to my religious beliefs,
Right,
you
we
get
go
away
the
with
other
that.
way.
So
So Garrett, we're about to go
it's
to a break. I want
unequal.
you to promote. Sorry, Garrett, didn't mean to interrupt you, but we were going to a break, so I want you to promote your show one more time.
All right, you can tune in. It's every Monday from 10 to noon. My co-host is Jack Monette, and we talk about religious liberty and what's needed to preserve it in Utah and across the nation.
Awesome.
So,
Thanks so
thanks
much,
for
Garrett.
all you do.
Appreciate you. So it's Monday, 10 to noon. This has been McClintock with Enoch Moore on K-Talk Radio, AM 630, k-talk.com with the Liberty Lineup Naked Truth segment. And we are headed off to our to the top of the hour news. We'll be right back with Lavoy Finicum's daughter talking about the latest news in Oregon.